Evening. I'm Dr. Shawna Nesbitt, Associate Dean of Student Affairs in the Office of Student Diversity and Inclusion, and I'd like to welcome you to our second in the series of anti-racism that we've offered this fall. We have an exciting speaker, and I am just delighted to hear his remarks. This is the second in our series. If you joined us 2 weeks ago, Dr. Lundy Braun gave us a riveting lecture about medical algorithms. Tonight's speaker is Bryan K. Fair. He is the Thomas E. Skinner Professor of Law at the University of Alabama School of Law. He is also the chair of the board of directors of the Southern Poverty Law Center. After earning his undergraduate degree from Duke and a law degree from UCLA, Professor Fair worked as an associate with Bryan K, McFeeters, and McRoberts in Los Angeles. In 1987, he joined the UCLA law faculty as a lecturer and co-directed its academic support program. He served as commissioner of the California State Bar Commission on Minority Access to the Legal Profession and as a public counsel for legal services volunteer. Professor Fair joined the Alabama Law Faculty in 1991. He was named the Thomas E. Skinner Professor of Law in 2000. He has received many accolades from his students as well as from the Alumni Association as an outstanding faculty member and as the university's outstanding commitment to teaching award that he's received each year that he's been on the faculty. He's held many administrative posts at the law school and the university, including vice president for academic affairs and associate dean for special programs, and the list goes on. He is the author of a book, Notes of a Racial Caste Baby, Colorblindness and the End of Affirmative Action, published in 1997. His research agenda remains focused on the equality theory under the 14th Amendment. He serves on the board of many organizations, and among them as board of directors chair of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Tonight, he will be speaking on the healing of a broken nation, overcoming the myriad effects of discrimination in the United States. And with that, I'd like to welcome our guest speaker, Professor Fair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nesbitt. It's a pleasure to be here with you and your colleagues and students this evening. I want to also thank Greta Epps for keeping me organized and making sure that I was able to link in this afternoon. To all the participants, especially the students, I want to thank you for sharing a bit of time with me today and allowing me to share some brief remarks and then to engage your comments and your questions. This is a challenging time for the country, and it's been a challenging time for the country for many, many years, depending on your position in the society. And most of my writing has been about the history of inequality in the United States. And as Dr. Nesbitt said, some years ago, I wrote a book about affirmative action policy in the United States and how that policy emerged. But I've written about lots of forms of inequality in the US. And most of my thinking about the kinds of conversations that we ought to be having center on the historical failure to uphold the equality principle from our Constitution. So what I'd like to do, and you know, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical person. I'm interested in the intersection of law and health, and especially the intersection of disparities and the many, many different disparities that we see in the life expectancy, the morbidity rates, that the types of diseases that some populations of people suffer through. And for me, the links to discrimination in our history that causes so much of those disparities. But again, I'm not a scientist or a medical doctor, but I admire you for pursuing this career. And my hope is that I will say something that encourages you to seek to understand the people that you serve, the communities that you serve, and to try to step into the shoes of those people and to understand their journey, because we're not all the same, and sometimes bias can influence decisions. On my side of law, we see lots of forms of bias that have, I think, damaged nationhood and who we are as a people in the United States. And whether it's implicit or unconscious bias, or whether it's overt bias, whether it's institutional structures from our society that have significant racial disparities or gender disparities or other sorts of disparities. I've been interested in those kinds of issues over my career. I have looked closely at the US Constitution now for 3 decades. And let me say to all of you, I love this country like other Americans. And I love it enough to criticize it, especially when it fails to meet the constitutional norms and ideals on which the nation was founded. I hope nothing I say tonight offends any of you, but I am a critic of the country and its failure to uphold the equality guarantee, which is, I think, the central value for a society that comes together and forms a nation. And I've studied inequality, and I also want to just say at the outset, I'm not only interested in disparities between folks who are racially classified or socially constructed as white, or the social construction of Blackness. I look across American society and American history, and I've looked at indigenous populations, and I'm very concerned about the life circumstances of so many Native American people in our society. I've looked at other, I've certainly looked at the period from slavery to Jim Crow segregation through the civil rights period, and I'm interested in the kinds of inequality that African Americans experience today. I'm interested in the experience of other immigrant groups, whether they're from the Asian Pacific Islands, whether they're from Central or South America, whether they're European immigrants or migrants who've come to the United States. And I'm most interested, I have been most interested in how the law can work to include or to exclude populations of people based on markers such as race, such as gender, such as sexual orientation, such as religion, the socioeconomic variables. There are lots of markers of discrimination in US history beyond race. And I've written about a number of those. I'd also say that I support diversity and inclusion, and I'll tell you what that means to me. What diversity means to me, especially in the educational context, is that students from different backgrounds come together, engage in conversations, learning, and they expose each other to different viewpoints and their own life stories, their own journey. And in that process, we are training people to be better citizens, to be more effective in decision making, to again see beyond various kinds of markers of discrimination. That's what I think about when I think about diversity and inclusion. And that's not what I write about mostly. What I write about mostly, again, is equity and the historic denial of equity to so many Americans in the United States. Again, the record, I don't think the record is one that can be contested. For most of our history in the United States, we've had a pro-discrimination policy in the United States against various groups, And only recently have we started conversations about confronting those long legacies of pro-discrimination. I teach at the University of Alabama, which was founded in 1831. For the first 60 years, no women could come to the University of Alabama. That is a pro-discrimination policy. For the first 130 years, no African Americans could come to the University of Alabama. The flagship school, the original seminary of learning, the pathway for so many Americans to advance their lives and the lives of their children and their grandchildren and so forth, was historically closed as a matter of policy, not a matter of talent, ability, as a matter of state and federal policy. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about equity and inequity in the United States. So I'm a champion of equity in response to historical discrimination against various populations of people in the United States. I make no apology for being a champion of equity. And I'll say in a moment what I mean by being a champion of equity. One of the things that it means for me is that I support pipeline programs. I support the use of resources, public resources, to open doors that have been historically closed, not because of talent, not because of ability, but simply because of certain markers of discrimination. And whether we reach back to elementary school, pre-K, to, again, elementary, secondary, university, and even advanced programs, I support pipeline programs and do a good bit of work with pipeline programs in the context of legal education. I mentioned a moment ago that I have been amazed by the inability of many Americans to see the ways in which structures and rules and policies in the United States continue to exclude people. And when I think about that, I'm certainly thinking about institutional racism. I'm thinking about institutional sexism and patriarchy. I'm thinking about other ways in which our institutions, whether they're governmental institutions, academic institutions, hiring processes, continue to, our educational system, how we track some people in our society to inadequate educational programs, and we track others to exceptional educational programs. And too often, there's a racial lens to that. Too often, historically, there's been a gender lens to that. And a famous example of that would be the University of Virginia having one of the finest public schools in the country, VMI, and saying categorically that no woman could attend VMI. And when challenged finally in the mid-1990s, the late 1990s, rather than admitting women to VMI, an exceptional educational program, Virginia decided to create a second class leadership program for women at a different school that would not have the alumni, that would not have the faculty, that would not have the reputation, none of the tangible benefits that men for generations have enjoyed at VMI. So I'm interested in institutional racism, institutional sexism, and how we, again, from my perspective, how we use law to dismantle those kinds of institutions, not just litigation, but also legislation, policy, again, resource reallocation to address the kinds of systemic, long-term levers of discrimination that have closed doors for so many people in the United States. In my work, I've been interested in the ways in which implicit bias influences the criminal justice system, whether it's the police, prosecutors, jurors, judges, and why, again, why we have disproportionate populations of African American, Latino people in prison in the United States. Why we have so many cases almost weekly around the country of police officers shooting and often killing unarmed Black men. What is it that makes a police officer think it's acceptable and permissible to use deadly force against unarmed persons who are in our society supposedly presumed innocent until proven guilty, right? A cornerstone of American law is the presumption of innocence. And it is enshrined in our Constitution that there is a privilege against self-incrimination. There is a due process clause. And so how is it in a society founded on principles of equality, equal protection of the law, a presumption of innocence? Again, that people should not lose their life or their liberty without due process of law. How is it that weekly we see law enforcement kill people? And what's being done about it? What sorts of policy changes are necessary to prohibit and constrain this kind of abuse of power? So implicit bias is a concept that people often talk about. And again, the notion is that all of us hold implicit biases, that we are socialized in this society, in this time, in this world, to think certain things about other people. And of course, I'm not assuming that this is always a conscious, overt bias. Again, the notion is that it's implicit, that it may be unconscious, subconscious. But if there are these kinds of biases in the law enforcement space and on the law side, again, I would just encourage each of you to think about, as you pursue your medical degrees and your careers, how does implicit bias work in the health side? We're going through an extraordinary health crisis, global pandemic. I hope all of you are staying well and that your loved ones are staying well, that you're doing everything you can to stay safe. I don't know the most recent number, 230,000 people in the United States or more, but too many people have died of COVID. And we know from studies that disproportionate numbers of them have been African American and Hispanic people. Again, if I'm not a doctor, but I do ask myself, why? What is it about pre-existing conditions? What is it about some people and the work that they do every day that positions them to greater exposure? Who are our essential workers? Who are they? Again, why is it that disproportionate numbers of people of color are being affected by COVID-19? That's a question, I think, for healthcare providers and for scientists. And of course, healthcare providers, you all will be the frontline workers for the next pandemic, which we're surely to have. And as people come to you seeking service, it's about how will you treat them? What will you think about them? So I think a good bit about implicit bias and learned behaviors. And I think all of us need to learn more about how those biases operate in the subconscious and whether they operate for us, how they operate for us. And let me just say, I grew up in the United States. I'm 60 years old. I certainly have been socialized to think about race, to think about gender. When I encounter people, I'm not colorblind. I've never been colorblind. I don't believe that colorblindness is a real thing. Maybe it is for you, but the colorblindness concept was enunciated in one Supreme Court opinion in 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson in the dissent. And what Justice John Marshall Harlan wrote there, he wrote two things. The colorblindness principle is the one that he's remembered for. But the first thing he wrote in Plessy versus Ferguson in dissent, he was the only dissenter who believed that Louisiana's policy to separate people by law into white sections of transportation and black sections was unconstitutional. The first thing that Mr. Justice Harlan, John Marshall Harlan, wrote was that the white race deems itself to be the dominant race, and so it is in education, in prestige, and he went on to say he thought it always would be. But then he said, under our Constitution, however, there is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. So on the one hand, he said, Justice John Marshall Harlan, a Kentuckian whose family had owned slaves, would later repudiate slavery, said the white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country, and so it is. Now, as a critic, that sounds to me like a declaration of white supremacy, coming from the highest court in the United States, right? There are other justices who would make similar statements about women and their place in the American society. But again, Harlan is remembered for not that statement, but this statement about colorblindness and as a constitutional principle. We have not had a principle of colorblindness in the United States. Anyone who knows anything about American history must know that that's not the case, right? Because the civil rights movement wouldn't make any sense. The Black Lives Matter movement wouldn't make any sense today if we've had a long history of colorblindness in the United States. The Me Too movement wouldn't make any sense if we had a long history of equality for women in the United States, where violence against women wasn't an everyday circumstance, right? Again, I can't begin to suggest for you how discrimination in our society leads to all kinds of health disparities. But I know that there's information out there. I have other colleagues who are health law colleagues who study the kinds of disparities that are grounded by race or framed by race, framed by gender, framed by socioeconomic status, and whether it's heart disease or diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity. We have communities in the United States that are effectively food deserts, where people have no meaningful access to healthy food, where a grocery store carryout is the closest place they have to shop. And those kinds of circumstances lead to all kinds of health disparities that I know that you all will confront and will need to solve and resolve in your service. But many Americans have lower life expectancies, infant mortality rates for children born to African American mothers versus white mothers, Latino mothers, Native American mothers. We have data to bear out the kinds of consequences, for me, of historic discrimination in the United States. And just so that it's clear, I do not blame Black people for their poverty. I don't blame Native American people for high incidence of alcoholism or suicide. I don't blame people who have been treated historically as outsiders in our country for the circumstances that they find themselves in. Whatever their personal responsibility, we as a society have a responsibility too. And as a lawyer, I hold the government responsible for historic discrimination that has left so many people outside of the American dream and the promises of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I think of myself as in the healing profession too. I want to heal this nation. I want us to be able to have conversations like this without feeling as if I'm accusing anyone of anything. I'm a part of this society too, and I'm accusing myself of being an American and not caring enough about the historic inequality that has left so many people behind. I'm one of the luckiest, most privileged people on the planet. I'm absolutely clear about that. I wasn't born that way, but I am today. I'm a tenured university professor. I have all the resources I could ever want, and I'm shielded from lots of abuse and discrimination. Violence doesn't confront me every day, but other people do. And what I've learned is much of my privilege hasn't been earned. I'm a male in a society that privileges being a male. I've had excellent educational opportunities. Not everyone has those. So again, I'm looking at myself too. I'm not just looking at, I don't even see all your pictures. I'm not just looking at you, I'm looking at myself too and holding myself accountable. But I'm in the healing profession. I'm interested in us having conversations that help us become a nation of different people, diverse people, beautiful people, but who care about each other and who recognize that we are stronger when we lift everyone up. So with those remarks, I'd love to hear reactions. I'd love to answer questions you have about anything I've said. You know, I welcome disagreement. I'm an adult and can separate disagreement with personal attacks. So with that, Dr. Nesbitt, thank you for this opportunity. And I want to thank everyone who joined. I didn't want to talk too long because I wanted to make sure there's time for questions. But you know, I've been a teacher a long time, so I can keep talking.
Well, great. Thank you so much for those sage remarks and really riveting thoughts. We are going to open the chat line, and if you have questions, please enter your questions. We'll read your questions to Dr. Fair or to Professor Fair and answer them as quickly and efficiently as we can. Dawn, do we have any questions already waiting?
Dr. Nesbitt, there's just one question that says, can you tell us a little bit more about what the SPLC does?
Sure. Well, thanks for that question. The Southern Poverty Law Center was founded 50 years ago to initially to bring cases against the Ku Klux Klan and to monitor hate and extremism across the United States. Initially centered in the Klan, but as we see today, hate and extremism covers many more groups. We work on educational equity, we work on immigrant justice, we work on mass incarceration. So we have a program called Teaching Tolerance, where we work with teachers around the country, providing resources to address multiple topics, a curriculum around teaching for a diverse America. The Intelligence Project is the hate and extremism portion of our work, where we monitor 1,000 hate groups across the country, maybe even more than 1,000, but roughly 1,000 hate groups. And then we have impact litigation. We have also done some voter engagement work, trying to encourage people to educate themselves and prepare to vote. So the work is broad. If someone is attacked by a hate group, we might be involved. With the pandemic, we decided to use some of the resources of the center to support local food pantries and to offset the hardship that so many communities were experiencing. So we've allocated $3 to $4 million to from Feeding America down to food pantries across primarily the Southeast. We've been working in immigrant detention centers. We have a case pending involving the provision of health care in prisons, in Alabama prisons specifically, both in terms of mental health services and basic health care. So we have lots of different areas of work. You can visit splc.org, visit the website, and I've been very, very fortunate to work with SPLC. We are in 5 different states. We have offices in 5 states. We have about 350 employees now. We started with 3 employees, and today we're over 350. And it's because of the generosity of people from across the country, sometimes people giving $10 a month for 50 years, that the center has been able to do the work that it's done. And I've been fortunate to be a board member and to work with very talented people there.
We are loading up questions here. Question came through: considering the socialization aspect, can you comment on current strategies academic systems could use to increase diversity and equity?
Sure. Again, most of my experience has been in the context of legal education. My first job in legal education was to design academic support programs for law students at UCLA. And those were small group learning opportunities for additional writing, to practice exercises, various kinds of skills workshops. And I've done that for the last 35 years or so. I've done that kind of work. I continue to do it here. When I meet students, when I meet law students, I tell every student that I meet, there's nothing that lawyers do that you can't learn to do and learn to do well. That's the way I begin my conversations with every prospective law student. That it's hard work, but they're learned skills that you can improve your writing, you can improve your oral advocacy, you can improve your research skills. There's nothing that any lawyer that you know, there's nothing that he or she does that you can't learn to do and learn to do well. And what students hear is that they belong, that somebody believes in them. And I say, you know, we don't admit people to law school that we don't believe can make it. And then I tell them, again, you've got to take advantage of every opportunity. You've got to go and meet your faculty. You've got to network and meet your colleagues who will be colleagues in the profession for years to come. But you have to be honest about where you are at the moment, and you have to believe that it's not just a 1-year journey or a 5-year journey. It's a journey over 30 or 40 or a career. And I tell my students that 35 years into lawyering and writing, I still revise everything that I write. That revision and feedback is part of, it's not, all of us go through that, even well into our careers, that we are still trying to sharpen our skills to improve the way we present. So I try to lift my students up. Whether they're Alabama students or students going elsewhere. I try to tell them that they belong, that they're not second-class citizens, and that they're not taking anybody else's place, that they're not there simply because of affirmative action. In fact, they're there now because we have more systems of equity than we had historically, when doors were closed to women, were closed to various minorities without regard to talent. And so those are some of the things that I try to do. I'm an advisor to lots of student organizations, the Black Law Student Association, for example. I've been the advisor for the past 30 years. And I, again, meet with, I do a welcome back reception every fall in a normal fall for African-American students, including the new students. I have them at my house and we have a candid conversation about how much work it will take to be successful, but that every one of them can do it. And I have other faculty come, I have returning students come, sometimes alums will come. So we do things like that. But we do it in a positive way. I don't meet people and presume that they can't do it. I'm meeting them and telling them what they have to do to be successful. And I try to show them how to do it, how to brief cases and really break down the cases and understand what the majority is saying, what the dissent is saying, how to extract rules. These are skills that can be learned. And I'm honest. I recognize that every student doesn't have the same cumulative educational experience. Not everyone's gone to an elite prep school. Not everyone's had AP classes. So I recognize that, and I tell them, we just have to recognize, you have to recognize where you are, what your background is, and it's about closing gaps rather than continuing the gaps.
Okay, we've got a number of questions waiting for you. Our next question, Professor Fair, thank you so much for your excellent talk. I'm a surgical resident here at UT Southwestern. We're interested in implementing a curriculum on race law and history of racism in the US. What advice do you have, especially when it comes to addressing these topics with people, both those receiving the lecture and those in administration, who might feel attacked by the racist history of the United States?
Well, I appreciate the question. There are a number of scholars who have written extensively about, again, the history of discrimination in the United States and the experiences of different groups by race. Two of the leading scholars in the United States are Richard Delgado and Jean Stefancic. They are a husband and wife team. They have the leading book on race and races and the law in the United States. Richard Delgado and Jean Stefancic. If I were setting up a program to do this, I would probably start with them and with their work. But there are many other scholars, Juan Perea out of Chicago, Angela Harris out of Berkeley, Devin Carbato out of UCLA. Of course, I've done a good bit of this work. The late Professor Derek Bell had a wonderful reader on race and American law. Bell's book focused primarily on Blacks and whites, whereas Delgado and Stefancic's work looks at the experience of indigenous tribal communities then and now, looks at the African-American experience, the Latino experience, the Japanese experience, the Chinese experience, and certain white immigrant groups who came and initially were excluded from opportunities in the United States. So it's a comprehensive reader. So I would probably start with Delgado and Stefancic, but if that's something you're trying to do, I'm certainly open to trying to assist you.
Great. Dawn, do you have a question in queue?
There is a question that says, what are your thoughts on reparations?
Well, I guess I have several thoughts on reparations. Again, given the writing that I do and what I've said so far, I would say there are lots of different groups that have legitimate claims to reparations in the United States. So again, for me, reparations isn't solely a question about slavery or segregation in the United States, although I think that is one of the legitimate claims. What I've tried to do in my work is to get people talking to each other about historical discrimination and how there are common features of that historical discrimination across groups, not just race-based, but gender and beyond, so that we might build coalitions to really respond. I think that there are institutional barriers specifically to reparations for African Americans. I think that, again, I want to be honest, I think that many whites don't believe that there's any responsibility for current generations to respond to that kind of historical exclusion, discrimination, labor exploitation, violence. And so I think, given the government that we have, the representative government that we have, it's almost impossible to get a reparations bill out of the federal level. There are a few communities, right? Tulsa, Oklahoma has been having conversations after greater scrutiny about the massacre, the race massacre from 1921. There are a few communities that want to have conversations and want to think about reparations, but I'm skeptical that at the federal level, each year a bill is introduced in Congress and it goes nowhere. Again, I think understanding systems of discrimination in our society and how they've impacted so many different people, and building coalitions among all of those people, I think would strengthen the chance of real remedies. So I think about remedies a great deal. I'm a lawyer, and when we go to court, we have to tell the court what remedy we seek for our clients. And so I'm very interested in remedies. And again, it seems like a remedy constraining the use of deadly force by police. We need a remedy there that is not just locale by locale, but a national remedy that stops the use of deadly force. Again, with reparations, I would see remedies as opening up educational opportunities, improving the equity of educational opportunities, so that more people in this country have meaningful educational opportunities, who then can lift themselves up out of poverty and become productive citizens. I said earlier, I'm one of the luckiest people on the planet, and I really believe that. But I was born into to a mother of 10 children, a single mother, and we eked out an existence because she was extraordinary, and because all of us worked to try to contribute to the family economy from a very young age. And some teachers believed in me and encouraged me. I wasn't gifted. I don't have a brilliant voice. I'm not a gifted athlete. I don't have the entertainment sort of thing. The way up and out for me was education. And yet, my elementary school was not one of the better elementary schools in Columbus. I participated in a voluntary busing program for middle school, and went back to the community neighborhood school for high school. And that high school was 99% African American. And it was not a premier school. We did not have many of our graduates go off to college. And again, we did not have the advanced curriculums that other schools in Columbus had for other kids. But again, with full disclosure, I had opportunities to attend Duke University and UCLA Law School through affirmative action programs that followed the Bakke decision from 1978. The Bakke decision was decided, and I entered college that fall. And it opened up enormous opportunities for me to go to an institution like Duke, where I had to work really hard to survive and catch up. But I had loving teachers who encouraged me. It was a small academic environment, a safe environment. So I realized as a child I was undereducated, but I was not uneducable. I was curious. and I could have been left behind. And for me, too many Americans, not just who look like me, but who look like other people, are left behind early in their lives. Jonathan Kozol calls this a death at an early age. When he, a former teacher, writes about the cruelty and what he calls savage inequalities in American schools. So that's what I would say to that.
Don't
I have
we have
another. Yep, I have another question. You mentioned historic discrimination and issues of the past several times. What is the current state of discrimination and what solutions do you propose to provide equality of opportunity moving forward?
Wow, that's a great question and a really hard question. I think that discrimination in our society is alive and well. Again, just one marker, it is still the case, despite federal law, that women earn on average 75 to 80 cents for every dollar a man earns for the same work. Now, since 1963, we've had an Equal Pay Act. And yet in 2020, it is still the case. That's discrimination. And so it seems to me that we do not have the will as a society to check that kind of discrimination. We enacted a Violence Against Women's Act in the United States, which was limited later by a subsequent Supreme Court decision. But violence against women is a kind of discrimination in our society that we have not checked. Part of the work that we do at SPLC is around voter suppression. Voter suppression is alive and well in the United States. So I don't want to be heard to say that discrimination is a thing of the past, that it doesn't exist anymore. Every day in American schools, there are children, certainly in Alabama, and I imagine in every state in the United States, who go to poor schools that don't meet annual yearly progress, with low reading skills, with low math skills. And then we have other kids who go to what look like college campuses with AP classes. That happens every day today in the United States. So again, I'm certainly not saying discrimination doesn't exist. It exists and it's widespread. And I think all of that could be fixed. I think what I'm describing as discrimination could be repaired if we had the will to do so as a society. If I cared as much about another child as I do my own, we could fix these kinds of issues in our society. But both as communities, small communities, we don't seem to have the will to fix these kinds of discriminations. We don't even acknowledge, in many instances, we don't acknowledge the past discrimination, nor the continuing discrimination, nor the effects of past discrimination in our society. So an acknowledgement, we rarely ever apologize for discrimination. And when we begin to think about remedies, the law actually, and this is a terrible thing for me to have to say as a lawyer, but oftentimes the law prevents remedies. It's interpreted and applied in a way that doesn't allow for a progressive response to discrimination. Again, affirmative action policy designed to open doors to promote inclusion, is in the courts regularly and often constrained to the narrowest of applications. School systems have to show that they've tried race-neutral solutions before they can even think about race-conscious solutions. So what I've come to see after 30 years of teaching is, as a constitutional law person, there are many obstacles to the kinds of reform that I believe we need in our society. But if more people had the will to confront discrimination, then remedying it, again, we spend billions, we spend trillions of dollars in government programs every year. And if we were committed to improving and making a more equitable society, it seems to me that we could do so. And I would start with education, but I wouldn't limit it just to education. I think the political power in the society is skewed in ways that disadvantages minority voting strength. I think addressing that, the Supreme Court has been unwilling to address that. It has basically turned back challenges to political gerrymandering. Every day we get a new decision from the court not wanting to step into what's happening with our election. Some people are interested in voter suppression today, and they're getting their way in some communities. The president was in court today trying to prevent counting 127 ballots in Texas, near Houston, Harris County. So discrimination is alive and well. It will be until more of us build coalitions around the kinds of discrimination that we see across these markers of discrimination.
Okay, I have another question for you. Could you talk about current laws, court cases regarding voting and how they fit into history of systemic racism?
Sure. So many of you know that in 1965, the president, Lyndon Johnson, signed the Voting Rights Act. Again, that's 1965. So that's 55 years ago. In 2013, the US Supreme Court, in a decision out of Shelby County, Alabama, ruled that certain portions of the Voting Rights Act were unconstitutional, striking down. So under the Voting Rights Act, certain jurisdictions in the United States, before they can make any changes to voting procedures, they had to submit those changes to the District Court in Washington, the Attorney General, Justice Department, for review. And that kind of check, systemic check on what jurisdictions like Alabama did pretty regularly, worked. But the Supreme Court decided that the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was antiquated, that Congress hadn't offered sufficient justification for it. The Supreme Court warned Congress that if it didn't offer new justifications for the Voting Rights Act, that it might be struck down. So Congress failed to explain why, even in 2020, 2010, 2020, we needed to be vigilant about political parties and what they would do with voting. And what are these kinds of things? In Alabama, the governor, not the current governor, but the most previous governor, closed voter registration offices in mostly African-American communities. That makes it harder to register to vote, especially if you're poor. You live in regions where you don't have transportation. There's no public transportation. The voter ID laws, again, if you make it, we should be making it easy for every American to vote, whether they are a person who was formerly incarcerated and has served his or her time and is now re-entering our society. We should be making it easier for those folks to vote, not harder. But there have been lots of efforts, and both parties do this. Both parties seek to protect incumbents, to skew redistricting, and through a process of gerrymandering, drawing lines so that essentially the candidate is deciding who votes for him, or her, rather than the people deciding who they will elect. And the Supreme Court has basically said, we're not going to get involved. Well, for me, that's just irresponsible. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the country. It's the only court that has the final say on what the Constitution means. And we should have a system in our society where every vote counts the same, where my vote is the same as your vote, where if you're a voting age, your vote is weighted the same. And in my view, I'll just add this, the Electoral College is antiquated. No one should win the presidency in the United States who doesn't win the popular vote. It is a fact that Senator Hillary Clinton received more votes than Donald Trump. And yet under the system, Donald Trump became the president. If Clinton received 3 million more votes, how are those votes treated equally? We should have a one person, one vote principle, which we supposedly do in the United States. But the Electoral College skews that, in my view, and it's time to revisit why we have such an antiquated system that doesn't honor the popular will of the people. So those are some of the things that are happening in the voting context. And Shelby County versus Holder would be a case, if you're interested, that you might read.
We have only a couple minutes left, but I do want to ask you one of the outstanding questions, and we have so many more questions. We're going to have to harness these questions and send them to you so you can give us answers for everyone who has sent so many questions. This from one of our students. Professor Fair, great talk. This has been super interesting, informative, and necessary. How would you recommend us going about continuing to advocate for anti-racism and reducing inequities as future medical professionals? I know this may be a loaded question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, as would I.
Well, thank you. Well, again, I'm certainly interested in these conversations. And I think they begin, there are these opportunities when we're with colleagues and institutions. There are the personal conversations that we have every day. Anti-racism requires sort of a personal commitment to each of us to really think through how race has been socially constructed, how gender has been socially constructed and used to divide and disadvantage some and to privilege and advantage others. I mean, that's the kind of conversation we ought to be having. And it's a hard conversation because, again, it requires us to think about our own families, the ways in which we've been privileged. As I said, I know that as a man in the society, I am absolutely privileged in enormous ways. And I have to own that. And I have to think about what that means for my daughter in this society, because I don't want her to be the victim of gender bias or gender discrimination, implicit or overt. So again, I think the conversations, they happen in organizations, they happen in groups, they happen in book clubs. I think some of you are going to have to take leadership roles. Some of you are going to have to become teachers, faculty, to continue these kinds of conversations with your students. Some of you are going to have to become elected persons and community leaders and advocates to be involved in the conversations there. Again, we have multiple social justice movements underway right now. There isn't just one. And I'm trying to be interested in all of these different movements and to understand their historical origins and to see again across these different organizational the ties that bind these claims. And so I think talking with your closest friends, with your family, talking with your classmates, when you have a chance to challenge and to call something out, being courageous enough to call it out, even if it might mean that you're upsetting someone, or it's when we don't call it out that we become complicit in it. And I don't want to be complicit in racism, in sexism. I don't want to be complicit in homophobia. I don't want to be complicit in it. And unless I call it out, unless I try to understand and step into the shoes, the skin of other people, then I may be complicit in denying them the same equality that I seek for myself.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Fair, for your time.
Thank you.
And sharing these really, really riveting comments. And I think you have given us a lot to think about. I assure you the comments that I've received in the chat box and the Q&A have all been laudatory of your conversation. We appreciate your time, and who knows, we may have to ask you back again.
It's my pleasure. And again, to the students, I wish you the very best on this journey. You're really starting this extraordinary career, and for the next 30, 40, 50 years, you're going to serve and make a contribution to the society that few people make. I hope that you will do so in the spirit of really what we've talked about, of thinking about people, caring about people, trying to understand the people that you're serving, and to make a difference in the society at large. But I wish you the very best. I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts with you, and I hope our paths might cross again. I'm sorry I didn't get to all the questions, but I'm easy to find. I'm at the law school, and my email is there online. So if you have a burning question that I didn't address and you want to reach out to me, please feel free to do so, and we can try to engage that way. But Dr. Nesbitt, thank you for the opportunity, and I wish you the best in the work that you're doing. I appreciate and admire your leadership.
Thank you so much. Well, for our audience, stay tuned. We have our third lecture coming on November 19th from Dr. Elizabeth Brondolo, and her topic is racial and ethnic discrimination, effects on health and healthcare delivery. I look forward to hearing her truly interesting topic. She's an author of many articles and a researcher at St. John's University in New York. And so with that, thank you all for joining us this evening. I look forward to seeing you the next time, and take care of yourselves. Be safe. Good night.